RI Unit Podcast Episode 4.
The Struggle for Global Dominance, the Rise of BRICS and Industrialization in the Developing World.
Welcome to another session hosted by RI Unit. Today we're going to delve into a discussion about the geopolitical situation that is unfolding, particularly taking a look at the ongoing struggle between two global powers, the United States and China, and the friction that is clearly intensifying there. And we're also going to have a look at the emergence of the BRICS group, partly as a result of this struggle, but also born out of the grievances of developing countries who feel underrepresented in international organizations. And tied to those 2 points, we're going to have a look at the ongoing efforts of developing countries to industrialize. And in that context, whether they are being blocked in that process by international forces. And perhaps if now with what many have called a bipolar or multipolar world, it has become easier for these developing countries to industrialize now that more options are open to them. So with that in mind, I'm joined by two experts on these topics today. Professor Radhika Desai is joining us from Winnipeg. Just a very brief introduction on Professor Desai. She is currently at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada. And today we have invited her because of really two books that to me show that she could offer her valuable contributions to our topic today, which are the Geopolitical Economy after US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire, which was written in 2013, but more recently, a book on Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, a Geopolitical Economy. Thank you, Professor Desai, for joining us today.
Great pleasure, Bram.
From the early morning hours in Winnipeg.
6 a.m.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. And then from the Netherlands, we have Dr. Howard Nicholas joining us once again. He's become a regular on the show now. And I think he needs no introduction, as we've seen him on the show quite a few times before. But we're also hoping to get good insights from Dr. Nicholas because of his history of many workshops and short courses on the global economy, and particularly on the global international and trade system, which he taught for many years at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. So welcome, Dr. Nicholas.
Thank you, Bram.
All right. So to kick it off, I was told I should call you Radhika, so I shall from this point on. So to kick it off, Radhika, I wanted to ask whether you could start off perhaps with reference to your latest book as to how you see this, the current state of the struggle between the US and China as global superpowers. Mainly as I see it, it's becoming apparent that the US is trying to block China in every way it can. Particular concerns seem to exist towards the Belt and Road Initiative, which China is trying to develop in multiple developing countries throughout Asia and Africa and Latin America. And also, of course, in terms of trade, the US is taking many measures to block China, not just to the US, but it's trying to contain China globally. So I was wondering what your insights were there and whether you see any implications for Sri Lanka.
Sure. So this is, of course, a very big question. So I'll try and summarize it as compactly as possible. So basically, ever since I wrote my 2013 book and a little bit before that, I've been arguing that the United States was never hegemonic. It tried to establish a type of world dominance, which it imagined that the British once had, but it never succeeded in doing so. This struggle intensified in particular after the collapse of the Soviet Union and so on. But that event, which was misinterpreted by the United States as a great victory for itself, when in fact the Soviet Union collapsed for reasons entirely internal to the Soviet Union, which we can discuss. But so it was not really a victory for the United States, but it interpreted this as a victory just at the time when, in fact, the adoption of neoliberal policies in the previous decade had already begun to undermine the United States economy, so that from never having succeeded to establish its world domination, although, despite having tried zealously, you come to a new phase in which there is a kind of dynamic interaction between two things that are going in opposite direction. The United States' desire to establish world domination, particularly based on the illusion that somehow, now that Cold War bipolarity was over, that it was living in a unipolar moment, this desire to establish a certain type of world domination was never keener. But the capacity to do so was being undermined by the deindustrialization, financialization, outsourcing, etc., of the United States economy, so that it was in decline. So on every front, US capacities were declining. So that's the broadest picture. Now, then where does China come in? So, well, the United States had begun making nice with China, as everybody knows, going back to the 1970s, initially in order to drive a wedge between between China and the Soviet Union, deepening the Sino-Soviet split, etc. But by the time the 1980s came around, with China launched on its path of reform and opening up, the United States saw this as an opportunity to acquire what was essentially a vast colony of industrious, productive people who could be relied upon to supply the United States with cheap manufactured goods, be essentially an outlet for the United States' own high-value capital exports, as well as capital itself, whether in the form of FDI or other means. So it imagined that it was essentially acquiring this sort of vast, as I say, colony that could be relied on to remain in neoliberal subordination to itself. But by the time the new century opened, it was already becoming clear that China had no intention of accepting this subordinate position. China had every intention of using every opportunity available to it, whether it took the form of US FDI or any other country's FDI, or access to markets, which of course expanded vastly with the accession of China into the World Trade Organization in the year 2000, and so on. Every opportunity, the ability to send students to study abroad, everything, to essentially contribute to not only the industrialization of China, but also an industrialization that was committed to making its way up the value chain. And this, the party state began to execute already in the certainly by the new century. This was obvious in the 1990s. People could still talk about China as an exporter of cheap, even shoddy goods, toys, and so on. But now China had to be taken seriously. So throughout the 21st century, we've had, we first had Bush Jr.'s steel and aluminium tariffs. Under Obama, you got the so-called pivot to Asia, because the awareness of a threat coming from China to the US industrial base. Remember, throughout all this, the US is deindustrializing. And of course, by 2008, the US had this financial crisis, which, by the way, I would say is not a was not the global financial crisis, as everybody seems to call it. It was a very North Atlantic financial crisis, and we'll come back to that later. But anyway, so the United States was continuing to get weaker, China was continuing to get stronger, and China's ability to turn its economy around on a dime in 2008 became very clear. They unleashed this massive investment boom. And then 2 or 3 years later, when that was exhausted in terms of what it could do to continue Chinese growth, then they have since been allowing wages to grow, and there have been all sorts of other changes to the economic strategy. But China has continued industrializing. Today, it is the producer of ever more sophisticated goods, as we see, whether we look at the chip situation or the EV situation, etc. So what we've seen is China has continued to industrialize, and that is why the United States sees China as a challenge. And that is why the United States is trying to block China's industrialization. Unfortunately, it's not going to work. Just as the US's ability to dominate the world economy did not work, simply because the world economy has become way too multipolar already by the time the US had the chance to even attempt to do this in the 20th century. But now China in particular, being a socialist economy, has essentially demonstrated that it can and very likely will overtake the United States, not just in terms of the quantity of production, in terms of GDP, but also in qualitative terms as the essentially the pace setter in a number of technological fields. So I'm not personally a great scientist myself, but I did read the ASPI report, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute report, in which out of some 40 plus 43, 44 areas of acute technological competition in the world, the Chinese were ahead in some 37 of the areas as well. So you can see that China is really quite a phenomenon. The reason for the United States antagonism is that is essentially the essence of imperialism. Imperialism wants to essentially reserve all the highest technology production for itself, and assumes that the rest of the world can successfully be confined to producing low technology, low value goods. And this, in the case of China, is manifestly failing. Hence the US's attempts to suppress China, which will not work.
I mean, it's an interesting view, because you indeed often hear the narrative that US has been the dominant power in, let's say, the 20th century. And I think people particularly point to the dollar, as having been, having had world money status for so long. But if I were to perhaps add to your thesis, it could perhaps be explained that there is this alliance among the Western countries. It's not just the US, but also definitely with backing from Europe, that has kept this financial system in place for a very long time, where the US dollar seems to have dominated and still continues to in global trade and global finance. And now looking forward, with China challenging that dominance, perhaps not of the US alone, but of the West as a collective. People are speculating whether the RMB is now going to be the next world money to replace the dollar, or whether the BRICS group are going to come up with an alternative currency as a group. I was wondering what your views were there, and really the implications for developing countries like Sri Lanka, who hold, of course, many of their foreign exchange reserves in dollars, but also have a lot of their foreign debt denominated in dollars, which recently was very relevant for Sri Lanka, given the defaulting on that dollar debt and the crisis that ensued.
Sure. So earlier, by the way, you had also asked me about the implications for Sri Lanka from the narrative that I told. So I should just basically go back there and simply say one thing, which is that the one lesson for all developing countries, including Sri Lanka, is that they need they need to prioritize their own industrialization, and this requires essentially an enormous amount of state intervention. It's not going to happen via the free market. What the free market does is only intensifies the subordination of economies to the West. So I just want to say that, and we'll probably come back to that. Now, to the questions that you pose about the dollar system. So and let me also begin here with the implications for Sri Lanka, and then I'll justify them afterwards. So the implication for Sri Lanka, from my point of view, is to, number one, take part in the BRICS and begin to build the foundation of a post-dollar system, because it's coming. Not just because countries like China and other countries, Sri Lanka, if they join China and the BRICS and so on, are making arrangements to move away from the dollar, but because the dollar system has its own internal contradictions. So that post-dollar era is probably coming sooner than you think. And so Sri Lanka had better prepare. So number one, participate in these efforts. Number two, do not take private sector loans in dollars. That's absolutely the wrong thing to do. If you need loans, first of all, you have to minimize the extent to which you need foreign exchange loans that are not in your own currency, and so you need to minimize that as much as possible. So do that, and finally, obviously, industrialize in such a way that your import needs are covered by your capacity to export competitively to the rest of the world. So you imagine that every year you need to import roughly $100 worth of goods. Your economy should be able to export successfully to the rest of the world goods worth $100 at least, so that you do not have to borrow money abroad to finance your import requirements. So that's my basically point about the implications for Sri Lanka. Now, let me come to the dollar system very briefly. My argument has been that the United States, the core of the US's attempt to emulate the British style dominance. They said Britain was dominant in the 19th century. We will exercise the same sort of dominance in the 20th century. Of course, the United States could not acquire an empire the size of the UK's. So it settled for saying, okay, just as sterling was once the world's money, so the dollar will be the world's money. Completely misunderstanding that sterling could only be the world's money because it was not a national currency, but an imperial currency. The key to the functioning of sterling, and even sterling did not last beyond a few decades as the world's money. The key to the functioning of sterling as the world's money was the ability of Britain to extract surpluses from countries like Sri Lanka, British India, and all her other colonies, essentially extract tribute, centralize them in London, and then export this as capital exports, not to the non-settler colonies, like South Asia or Africa or the Caribbean, but primarily to Europe, to North America, so Canada and the United States, to South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, so essentially Europe and its offshoots. And that's what essentially kept the sterling system going. The United States does not have any such source of capital with which to make capital exports, any source of money that it could appropriate. So essentially it tried to initially up between 45 and 71 to run the dollar system essentially by running deficits. This failed. By 1971, that arrangement had to be closed down. And since 1971, my argument is that what appears to be a sort of steady dollar dominance from then until now is actually being based on a series of what I call financializations in the plural, expansions of dollar-denominated financial activity, which would counteract the Triffin dilemma, because the Triffin dilemma is very simple. If you're going to supply the world with liquidity by running deficits, there's a contradiction. The bigger your deficits, the less attractive your currency, so people will reject it. And indeed, the Europeans in the previous period rejected it, then forcing the break with the gold link, because they said, since you are giving gold instead of the dollar, give us gold instead. that link had to then be broken. And since then, what has happened is there has been, initially lending to third world countries, then Japanese lending to the United States, then the com bubble, then and even the East Asian bubbles of various sorts. All of these dollar-denominated financial activities essentially expanded the role of New York as a giant casino in which elites from those countries which do not have capital controls or have loose enough capital controls can put their money, so they can and therefore show their confidence in the dollar system. And so this counteracts the Triffin dilemma, downward pressure on the dollar, because the United States deficits never went away. There is a trade deficit, there is a fiscal deficit, there is a current account deficit. So these deficits continue to put downward pressure on the dollar, but this is then alleviated by the inflow of money from the rest of the world into the dollar system. So you have these series of financializations. Today, we are sitting on the everything bubble after the bursting of the housing and credit bubble. So this is essentially, and this everything bubble today is not working on its own, despite the successes of the last few decades of getting countries to open capital accounts and getting elites corrupt and elites to put their money in the dollar system, etc. The US Treasury the US Federal Reserve is having to support even the Treasury market and all sorts of asset markets today, because they will collapse. And the moment they collapse, the dollar system will not have any basis, because its basis has been these bubbles. Essentially, it has been resting on these bubbles. So in that sense, this is my analysis of the dollar system. So in addition to countries moving away from it because of the weaponization of the dollar system, in addition to countries moving away from it because of the unattractiveness, essentially, of the dollar system, the availability of Chinese finance, etc. All of these factors, you have to add the internal contradictions of the dollar system. And so between them, the end of the dollar, as I say, is probably coming sooner than you think. And one other point, whenever, the dollar system has a little chorus of essentially mainly American analysts, scholars who keep talking up the dollar system. They will point to things like, look at, still 70% of the world's transactions are in dollars. What they forget is that bulk of these transactions are financial transactions. These are financial transactions that are themselves inflated because there is a vast inflation of the value of the wealth in the world. Today, practically every asset market in the United States is in bubble territory. So these valuations themselves are creating these transactions which look very big. So these are financial transactions. The actual transactions that countries need for their trade relationships, their investment relationships, is tiny. So the effort involved in for countries like Sri Lanka and other countries who are willing to impose capital controls, the effort required to move away from the dollar system is actually not that great. The arrangements they have to make are not that extensive. So those arrangements are being made, and about them, I will only say one thing. I find that there is a lot of discussion, and you also asked about the renminbi. So my argument has always been that actually what the experience of both sterling and the dollar show is that the currency of one country cannot easily be the currency of the world. Marx, in his, even in volume 1 of Capital, in the chapter on money, is very explicit. He said there is no state at the world level. So what passes for money at the world level is actually not money. It's gold. Gold is not money. Gold is a commodity. Because there is no world government, there is no world money. And Keynes also understood this. So when he went to Bretton Woods in 1944, he basically said, why don't we create a system, an international clearing union, which will issue bankers to various member countries depending on their trading and investment needs. And this currency will not be used by you and me to buy a bar of chocolate or a pair of shoes. It will only be used by central bankers to settle imbalances among countries. That is so that all countries will continue to use their domestic currencies. There is no need to create a currency that is both used by central bankers internationally and in daily transactions. So every country will continue to use its own currency. It will have a certain relationship with the international currency, which Keynes called Banco. He said he wasn't happy with the name. You can call it anything you like. But this is the kind of arrangement we need to think about. I think everybody who is talking about issuing or creating creating a currency that will be both domestic and international, that's not going to work. And a final point is that since the currency of no country can be the currency of the world in a stable way, in a way that is not destructive either to itself or to the rest of the world, and at the moment the dollar is both, it will have to, you will have to create such a currency. The renminbi will not be, I would say, is not even trying to be such a currency. It will be internationalized to some extent, but I would say that a lasting solution can only take the form of a Keynes type arrangement, an international clearing union type arrangement. So I'm not looking for the renminbi to replace the dollar, because in order for the renminbi to play the same role as the dollar, China would have to financialize like the US. If China financializes like the US, it will destroy its productive economy. And if you read books about how currencies have behaved in the recent past, you will see that Japan or Germany, in the days when they were productively powerful, actively resisted the internationalization of their currencies beyond certain limits, because they knew that what would be the result. You need a very different type of financial system to support the kind of dollar system that we have right now, which is, as I say, extremely destructive for the dollar, requires financialization, focus away from production towards finance, etc. And you require a very different type of financial system that is able to sustain the type of industrialization experienced by China, which is the greatest industrial revolution that we have so far experienced in the history of humankind. So if China if the renminbi is industrialized, China is finished as that sort of industrializing as industrial power.
Well, I think your point on that what is upholding the dollar still is its extensive use in financial transactions, of course, relates very directly to Sri Lanka, who took out just between 2015 and 2019, 10 billion worth of international sovereign bonds, all dollar denominated. And many developing countries across the world did this. And I know, Howard, that you have been very critical of this strategy that Sri Lanka had, or the government, at least at that time. Do you think there's any possibility now with the new president, Mr. Desai, to maybe shift away from the ISBs and generally dollar-denominated debt? Would that be a difficult thing to do? And what would be an alternative then?
Yes, thanks, Bram. Thanks, Radhika, for that very comprehensive look at the relations between China and the US. Before I answer the question you just asked of me, something jumped up in the middle of what you were saying, Radhika, and that is the role of Europe. Now, up till, let's say, 15, maybe 20 years ago, but 15 years ago, Europe was a real industrial threat to the US. And I think this signing of an agreement with Russia for gas and oil was a game changer in principle, because as we know, energy costs are actually the bedrock of any industrial economy. And that threatened to reduce the cost price of European goods dramatically, which would have been a further nail in the US coffin. Now, what I don't get is why the Europeans have committed economic suicide. I mean, what is it there are all these conspiracy theories that the US has penetrated the European political establishment, and especially the German political establishment, and the Greens are essentially hell-bent on destroying Germany as an industrial power. But, the German business community is an incredibly powerful group, and if they really wanted to, they would have destroyed the Greens without any shadow of a doubt. Now, I don't get what is happening, because Germany is definitely in trouble. And if Germany is in trouble, Europe is in trouble. And you can see this even in the numbers. So the US is going to grow at 3%, and Europe will be lucky to avoid another contraction. And all the political developments have shown that one of the consequences is the rise of nationalist right-wing parties. I'm not getting what is happening there, and it's a very important aspect of all of this, because up till recently, the Europeans were very happy to work with China and do business with China, as well as Russia, because it was a win-win for everyone. And now, for some inexplicable reason, they have essentially said, okay, we'll commit suicide for the benefit of the US. And I was just wondering whether you had some thoughts on that. And perhaps I come to, so answer to Bram is this, one of the suggestions.
No, my interview has been hijacked. Yeah.
Sorry.
No. Let Radhika respond first. It's an interesting
thanks.
line of,
yeah.
Sure.
Sorry.
I mean, so I would say that, gosh, I mean, this is exactly what I've been wondering about, and trying to read as much as I can about. And I think that the way I look at it is as follows. Let me, if you don't mind, I'm just going to take a long run at it, because I think that it's worth it, because this is a very critical question. If you go back to Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, he's saying a couple of things. What he's saying is that imperialism, which has taken the form of competitive imperialism between these various centers of capitalist production, the Europeans, various European countries, the United States, Japan, etc., all of these countries at that point in around 1914, 1916, had finished dividing up the world amongst themselves. So the only thing that could now happen, according to Lenin, was a fight to redivide it, with the losers trying to get more and the winners trying to stop them, etc. And I think that, to me, all of those people who said that after 1945, that Lenin was wrong, that there was nothing inevitable about rivalry among capitalist powers, they could be shown to cooperate amongst one another, this is wrong. Although, of course, the existence of the Soviet Union and later China and the entire communist bloc, as I like to say, which stretched from Prague to Pyongyang, the existence of this bloc did force them to unite to some extent. Important tensions remain. So you will remember that, for example, France left the military command of NATO for many years, from the time of de Gaulle to 2006. You will remember that it was the Europeans that essentially forced the United States to break the dollar's gold link, because they said, and they drained the US of gold by saying, keep your worthless dollars, we will take gold instead, since that's what you're giving us. In the 1970s, again, the Europeans essentially told the US that it must discipline itself, it must stop exporting inflation. And throughout all of this, the effort to create the European Union was, if you go back to Ernest Mandel's book, Europe versus America, it was clearly an attempt to try to establish a market of the size that would rival the United States. And of course, the EU market is today even bigger than the United States. So it was an attempt to do that. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Europeans they tried to create an independent foreign policy for Europe, which of course the United States scuttled by the particular manner of its intervention in the Yugoslav conflict. In the 2000s, once again, the talk of a common security policy came up, and that talk has not gone away. Jens Stoltenberg, the retiring head of NATO, in his speech that he gave a few days ago, he was very explicit as a member of the captured elite, the elite of Europe that has been captured by the United States. He delivered one key message. The European elites should not forsake their special relationship with the United States, so they should remain harnessed to the United States. But the fact is that conscious European elites know that it's not just about the Nord Stream pipelines and so on. And by the way, all European elites know who has blown it up, that the United States had a hand in doing this, but they are essentially choosing to remain quiet. So the United States has essentially seen its effort to try to establish some sort of world dominance has included the subordination of Japan and Europe, and it has repeatedly scuttled this. Now, today, there are two possibilities. One is that the European elites have lost their nerve, and they cannot stand up anymore to the United States. And if this is so, then I would say that the popular dissatisfaction that is manifest on the streets and in the electoral, in the voting booths of Europe, which we are seeing everywhere, this dissatisfaction will have to find new leaders. The creation of Sarah Wagenknecht's Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht is a very interesting development. I think that such forces should develop elsewhere in Europe, will have to develop elsewhere in Europe, unless the left has become so spineless as to give the discontents of the present situation over to parties like the AfD. So that's one possibility. But the other possibility is that elements of the bourgeois elite still retain some element of progressive, some element of a desire for autonomy, etc. There are figures like Gerhard Schroeder, and I would say even Angela Merkel. I mean, remember, it was Angela Merkel who, as you rightly pointed out, struck out on her own, said, made nice with Russia, said, okay, let's do an energy deal, because that's like, it's a no-brainer. Where should Europe get its energy? From Russia, of course. And why would Europe want to make an enemy of Russia? Europe has more to lose from doing so, while the United States has everything to gain from the Europeans doing so. So essentially, the way I look at it is that we are looking at a sweet, for the United States is looking for the moment at a sweet spot in which the leadership in various European capitals are essentially its creatures. But it's not going to last forever, not least because ordinary Europeans, as well as presumably at least some members of the European elites, are very upset about it. And I'll just say one other thing. The Europeans, after the launching of the euro and the financial deregulation that took place during this time, European financial institutions for a brief while thought that their future lay with joining the financial party that was essentially going on in the US. So they, because the euro was created and the deregulation was going on just around the time when the United States was inflating the credit and housing bubbles, they ended up being the main part of the world. So Britain and the Eurozone countries became the main investors in the toxic securities that were being generated in the US financial system. They were the ones who bought it, which is why I call it a North Atlantic financial crisis, because while the rest of the world suffered a short, sharp trade shock, the UK and the Eurozone were mainly the parts of the world that had invested in these securities. They suffered the most. In Europe, the 2008 was followed by the 2010 Eurozone crisis, whose foundations were laid by the 2008. So, but since then, European, once bitten, twice shy, European capital flows into the US system have rapidly decreased, and they did not recover to the same extent. So there are many contradictions. The United States is definitely trying to resubordinate Europe, but it is not a done deal. We're going to have to see how the contradictions unfold in the coming years.
Well, and I think as a consequence of that effort, they have now done what you were also previously referring to, and what Kissinger was so adamant about, is driving a wedge between China and Russia. That used to be very important in US foreign policy, but now wanting to subordinate Europe, they have actually driven, or in my view, driven Russia closer to China again. Because as far as I can tell, Putin and many other political figures in Russia have been clear, it's now over. They're not going to try anymore with Europe. It's, that's something of the past. They tried many times, and this was the final straw for them. And I think this is now, it brings us to our second point, really, is this formation of the BRICS group, where, in effect, the US is actually driving these countries closer and closer together. Even India and China, who have, I think, many differences and altercations among themselves, are now still having so many similar goals that they seem to be driven closer and closer together in this BRICS group that is now emerging. What are your thoughts there, Radhika? Like, is this?
But don't you want
something...
Howard to answer the question that you put to him before?
I mean, clearly didn't want to answer it. That's a typical dodging of the question. So no, well, I'm interested to get to the point of the BRICS, because I think this is also a question that has been asked of the incoming president. Not just is he going to do something to shift, let's say, away from the US and a bit more towards China, as was previously the case, also having implications for, let's say, dollar reserves and dollar-denominated debt. But now questions are being asked whether the new president should submit a formal application to the BRICS group, which is now becoming such a large entity with so many apparent benefits for developing countries, that the pressure is greater and greater. And I know that even in the previous government, the foreign minister joined a BRICS meeting in Russia, I think it was last year. So clearly the push is there, but now will they do it is the question, and what benefits are there for them?
Sure. So I would say, first of all, that when we are discussing the BRICS, the original acronym referred to 4 countries, then South Africa was added, and we refer to them as a group. But quite frankly, it is a very uneven group. There is China, and then there is everybody else. To a lesser extent, I would say now Russia is becoming, under the pressure of sanctions, war, etc., is becoming more of a planned economy. But for the rest of the BRICS, Brazil, South Africa, India, and all the other new entrants, there is a huge problem. Now, first of all, the formation of the BRICS should be seen in a longer perspective of efforts by the developing world, going back to Bandung and the demand for the new international economic order, and various negotiations of the WTO in which they tried to get their concerns in. All of these are important chapters in the history of BRICS, essentially saying, or not BRICS, but developing world, essentially saying that we need forms of international economic governance that are conducive to our development. Now, I would say that some of the most ambitious and I would say meaningful advances towards this took place in the era when most of the developing countries were trying to pursue some type of national autonomous development, which was distinctly left-leaning. It involved the vision of a relatively egalitarian economy, vision of industrialization through import substituting industrialization, later followed by second stage ISI, etc., etc. So all of this was at its peak in the 1970s. And then since then, we've had the onset of neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism has, unfortunately, even though most countries today have not, the BRICS countries anyway, have not adopted it in any kind of a simple-minded way. You know, even in India today, we have substantial public ownership and so on. But it has proved pretty insidious. And in particular, vis-a-vis, well, there are two or three things in particular that have happened. So number one, state capacities have been massively reduced. Partly because it is generally assumed that private sector can do things much better. So instead of the state expanding its capacity to do this, that, or other, it is easier to contract to private sector companies to provide whatever is needed, whether it's schools or hospitals or roads or garbage removal or what have you. So state capacities are reduced. Secondly, capital accounts have been relatively liberalized so that the economic elites of countries like India or Brazil or South Africa, of course, it's like practically a foundation stone of post-apartheid South Africa, that they will have completely liberal capital flows, which is a sentence of death. I mean, South Africa cannot industrialize without having capital controls, and it desperately needs to do so. So the loosening of capital controls have allowed companies, for example, from India, to essentially borrow from abroad in completely reckless ways, which bring with them the danger of debt crises and so on. And of course, for countries like India, one of the things that keeps our current account relatively in balance is the remittances sent by hundreds of thousands, in fact, millions of Indians working abroad, not those professional types and rich people who migrate with kit and caboodle with their family, who have no reason to send remittances back, but the lower class migrants who go, one at a time. The woman goes or the man goes, and then the family is still back home and they send remittances. And the sweat of the brow of these people is keeping the Indian current account in balance. And what is it being used for? Not for any developmental purpose which would reduce the need for such desperate forms of migration, but rather for forms of development in which, as I say, practically everywhere in the world these days, it would probably be true to say that governments seem to have a one-point economic policy, which is to do what your biggest corporations want, and everybody else can go to hell. I mean, they don't care. They don't even care about medium and small scale business, let alone ordinary working people. So in that sense, I would say that the BRICS category is very disparate. And China is succeeding because it is a genuinely socialist economy. Yes, it has big corporations. Yes, these corporations are very powerful. Yes, they are even members of the Communist Party. But at the end of the day, the party and the party state or the government controls them, not the other way around. And unfortunately, in the rest of the world, we see more and more that there are governments that are essentially doing the bidding of the big corporations, and that is not the way to industrialize. In fact, every successful industrialization that we have witnessed so far, whether we go back to Germany or Japan in the 19th century, or even the United States, or more recently South Korea, Taiwan, etc. What you see is that it has been because governments have been able to impose their priorities on private capital due to extraordinary reasons. Although they remain capitalist economies, the existence of extraordinary conditions have allowed this to take place. China still does that, but unless the rest of the world can do that, they are not going to. They're not going to be. They may not even grow. I mean, under Modi, the Indian economy has been completely, it's been a disaster. Same under Bolsonaro. So there is always the possibility of such leaders coming to power and destroying whatever advance that was made in previous years. So I would say that so Sri Lanka and so they should join the BRICS. I mean, the basic rationale of the program, which is to change the conditions of international economic governance in such a way that it is conducive for the development of the rest of the world, are good. But I would say that they don't just need to sort of partner with China or to a lesser extent Russia, but they also need to learn from them. And they need to understand that they will have to create the kind of infrastructure of a developmental state, which is the only thing that can actually make them fully benefit from their relationship with China. I'll just make maybe two further quick points. Well, maybe no, just one for now. I've always maintained that countries will, a lot of countries are very happy to partner with China, and China is indeed a more benign partner in terms of both trade as well as investment relations than the West is. And that's one of the reasons why the West is losing, is because China is becoming the biggest and most important economic partner for most countries in the world. However, even this has seen, oddly enough, it has had bad consequences. So partnering is good. But in addition to partnering, you also must learn from China. Now, China, for its part, is very correct. And it says we do not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. We will have, we will lend money, we will do this, that, etc. We will make investments and so on. But and they have generally been willing to renegotiate loans on decent basis and so on. But the problem is that China is still running into the problem where its BRI lending and its other lending to third world countries has had to be curtailed because these countries, because they are not learning from China, they are only partnering with China, are not able to pay their debts back. And China is not going to throw good money after bad. It's not exactly a very rich country. It is, it is now much better off than most third world countries, but still, it has to conserve its resources. So it's not going to throw good money after bad. So its lending has been curtailed. And so we are in a certain point, at a point where we really have to drive this lesson home, that countries like Sri Lanka or India or Brazil and South Africa need to move away from whatever vestiges of neoliberalism there are. They need to create developmental states, and then they will benefit. The mutual benefit that China wants to see with trade with all these countries and investment relations will be realized, because at the end of the day, if China wants to export to these countries need to be able to pay for their exports. And as long as they are unable to do so, China cannot keep exporting to these countries either. So it's to create a truly win-win situation, you need to learn from China as well. And I say learn from China very carefully, because Chinese leaders are very careful. They say we are not trying to be a model for everybody, and they are right. I mean, nobody can replicate the Chinese Revolution, but each country must, in its own, given its own history, its own resources, its own difficulties, it needs to create a developmental state suited to itself.
Well, and the philosophy you referred to earlier of this independent policy making that used to actually be a much bigger thing in, say, the 70s and 80s among developing countries. I'd say in Sri Lanka, anyway, it seems to have completely disappeared. Howard, you and I have been in quite a few discussions where the prevailing opinion now is actually that Sri Lankans are unable to come up with a proper economic strategy. And so the conclusion is that they must take it from international bodies like the IMF, do exactly what the IMF tells you to, do exactly what the Americans tell you to do, and don't come up with an independent strategy. And even though I agree that China is far less interventionist, I'd say the same philosophy applies. If China would tell you what to do, also don't listen. It should be what is best for Sri Lanka. But Howard, what's your thinking there? Because I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges for the incoming or the new president, is dealing with this resistance from the business community and the academic community as well, of shifting away from the IMF formula and the US formula. Indeed, very much neoliberalism based. How do you think he can navigate that?
I think Radhika said it, we need a proper development state strategy. And there, Radhika, I mean, we're never too old to learn. I was rereading Alice Amsden, and I was absolutely astonished by what she said regarding Taiwan and the Kuomintang when they first started. Actually, they were more statist than Mao. And they condemned the Chinese government for its revisionism. So Mao was condemned for revisionism because they wanted everything state controlled. And it was only 30 years after they started that the US was able to force them to privatize quite a number of industries. And if you read, let's say, the IMF, the World Bank, the neoliberals, you get the impression that this was this great neoliberal experiment from the word go. And it's absolute nonsense. And Amsden says, I mean, she uses such disparaging terms against these people as basically illiterate. They have never read anything whatsoever. And then she goes on and says Korea was exactly the same. Not as extreme, but still, it was a development state. And most of the strategic industries were state-run industries, including the one that is often the Steel Corporation, which everyone sort of lauds and says how important it was and how fantastic it was. It was a state-run company. So, that's very important as a message for the Sri Lankan government, because there's this endless pressure to go with the IMF policies and to basically privatize everything. I mean, recently the pro-privatization people came with a book sponsored by the British ODI. And there, you're just reading neoliberal policies, left, right, and center. And why I say
what book is this?
I forget, but it's edited by Ganeshan Vignaraja, and you have the usual cadre of neoliberals, people who have been in government and advising this last government, and writing, frankly, rubbish without any empirical evidence to back. I mean, not even simple charts and tables, and that's what it is nowadays. Government is inherently bad, is inherently corrupt, etc., etc. But, the way forward is liberalize everything. Now, the important thing there, and that is something maybe you're not fully aware of that has happened, is they've set a minefield for this government. A minefield in terms of a lot of legislation that makes navigation very, very difficult. For example, we have a Central Bank Act, I think it's unique in the world, where the central bank is prohibited from buying any government debt. So if the government runs any budget deficit, which it has to run, if it's going to do any active policy, immediately interest rates will go through the roof. You see? So actually, it inhibits any type of activist intervention. And there are 2 or 3 other pieces of legislation. And what we've heard since the time that this president has been elected is a chorus of people saying, don't change the existing legislation, don't abandon the IMF policies, etc., etc. Because now what has happened is they've tied the hands of this government. And they've agreed to a debt restructuring, which actually makes everything far worse, because virtually all the foreign exchange that's going to be earned is going to be used to repay debt in the future. And our debt burden is massive, which then brings me to what Bram asked as a question. What would you do? Well, what I think Sri Lanka could do is replace a lot. Well, first and foremost, don't ever again borrow commercially, internationally, ever. And whether it's dollar or any other denomination, don't do it. The second thing is try and replace this debt with bilateral debt. And there, not just replace it with bilateral debt, but also do deals with countries that are interested in supporting our industrialization. So we get the loans, which are on concessional terms, but in return, we want to do joint ventures with them. We want to encourage them to do infrastructure for us. In other words, we want to build up our productive capacity. Because in the end, we'll still have to repay them as well. We'll still have to service that debt. And there's no point us thinking we're going to rely on tourism, because that's not going to save us, nor are private remittances. These are the two main foreign exchange earning capacities that we have. So from my perspective, I think this government first has to pay attention to getting that parliamentary majority, because without that parliamentary majority, they can't begin to think of amending some of the legislation or saying they have a mandate to renegotiate the deal with the IMF. But once they get a parliamentary majority, then you can start talking. But at this moment, I would say they're doing the right thing and not talking. Because the more they talk and the more they promise, the worse the problem is going to be, because it's going to be used also against them, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think they're doing the right thing. They're concentrating on winning the parliamentary election. And then once they get a mandate, they can say to everyone, look, we've been given a mandate to resurrect this economy. We've been given a mandate to actually do what we should have done a very long time ago, which one president tried to do. His name was Premadasa, Ranasinghe Premadasa. He tried to industrialize. He was a nationalist, an uneducated nationalist, I might add, who didn't like Western advisors, basically because they didn't speak the local language and he couldn't speak English. But he has been by far and away our best president in the last 30 to 40 years, by far and away, because in the short space of time he was able to do something. He began that industrialization process, which was long overdue. I mean, it was started in the 1970s, discontinued, but he resurrected it, but was unfortunately assassinated. So I think we're all on the same page. There needs to be a development state. It needs to be committed to industrialization. But what I've now found, and what you might have noticed in the run-up to the election, we are not allowed to use that term even, industrialization. I don't know if you know this and even know the book by, not the book, the article, the famous article 2019 by two IMF people that say the policy that has no name. Have you heard of that article? So they actually tell you in the corridors of the IMF and the World Bank, you are not allowed to use the term industrial policy. And this actually should tell everybody in the world what really is the one policy that'll get developing countries out of their problems. Obviously, industrial policy. And they do not want it because it's never a win-win situation. If the developing countries tomorrow industrialize, you can be rest assured that the West is not going to enjoy the living standards they currently enjoy. I mean, we've already seen the damage done to them by China. And so I think actually this is a do or die situation for the West, and they're closing ranks on that. However, I think given this geopolitical environment, there is a card for all developing countries to play. And I would say, that's where the independent line comes in. We don't care whether it is the US or China or whoever. You help us industrialize, we will be your friend. That is exactly what Vietnam has said. And that is exactly what they have achieved, because the West has opened up its markets to Vietnam. They've said, if you befriend us, we will join your camp. If anyone believes that Vietnam has really joined the Western camp and dumped China, then they're not looking at data. But it's what recently I was having a chat with some African diplomats at a conference, and we were discussing the problems and obstacles facing African countries. I said, you're in the driving seat now.
Mm-hmm.
They want your support. So why don't you simply say, okay, China has opened up its markets to us, to our manufactured goods. Why don't you do the same thing? Okay, we have no particular loyalty to anyone except ourselves. If you help us industrialize, fine, But of course, you retain that independence, a bit like Singapore has managed to do, to retain that independence.
Can I,
Well,
sorry, may I just respond with three brief points?
go
I
ahead.
hope we are not hijacking your interview, but I just, because Howard said three very important things, and I think they're relevant because they're I'm filling gaps in what we said earlier, things that should have been said earlier. So number one, industrial policy. I want to make 3 points. Number one, industrial policy. Number two, borrowing from private sources abroad. And number three, on the issue of, as Howard says, retaining independence and going with whoever helps you industrialize. So number one, industrial policy. The situation in Western countries is now so bad, including in the United States, that they are also talking about industrial policy. But what we have to be very careful of, so the Biden administration is allegedly following industrial policy, if you believe Robert Reich. But Robert Reich is just a Democrat, and he's just trying to boost the Biden-Harris camp. So that's what he's claiming, that, Bidenomics is working and blah, blah. But in fact, what industrial policy amounts to is simply what industrial policy, in quotation marks, as the Biden administration has rolled it out, amounts to is simply a new phase of neoliberalism. And by new phase of neoliberalism, I mean a new way in which they can help a small number of big corporations, which is essentially that industrial policy has become another excuse for giving them big subsidies. So I think we need to be sure that there is this fake industrial policy stalking the globe today, and we need to make sure that our meaning is very different from them. That's why I underline the point that you need a state that controls capital, including the biggest capitalist corporations, and insists that they need to make productive investments rather than becoming financialized, which is why the United States is even talking about industrial policies, because this sort of policy of neoliberalism, which has been accompanied by financialization, has essentially deindustrialized the United States. So that's the first point. The second point I wanted to make was that, again, part of the reason for the Sri Lanka debt crisis, and the more generally the debt crisis that pervades the third world today, Sri Lanka is not the only country that is facing a debt crisis. It has mechanics that are astonishingly similar to the third world debt crisis of the 1970s. In both of these eras, what you had was a first world situation in which, though for different reasons, you essentially had a growth slowdown, which of course was even worse in the last decade, since 2008. Than it was in the 1970s. But nevertheless, in both cases, there's a growth slowdown. There is at the same time a vast expansion of financial activity. And in particular, of course, I won't go into the differences between the two, but there's a vast expansion of financial activity, and first world financial institutions, because they have hardly any demand for borrowing from domestic capital, go around touting loans to third world countries. That's what happened in the 1970s, and it laid the foundation for the third world debt crisis, in the sense that after Volcker jacked up interest rates in the late 70s, early 80s, and all these third world countries had borrowed at a time when interest rates were not just low, they were often negative, suddenly found themselves in a debt crisis, subject to IMF and World Bank structural adjustment programs and conditionality and all that. The same has happened here. Throughout the 2000s, you have had third world countries being able to borrow on international markets because of easy monetary policy in the first world countries, whose purpose was to continue inflating asset bubbles, first the housing and credit bubble, and then the everything bubble. This easy monetary policy meant that financial institutions in the first world countries went around giving loans to third world countries. It was not because third world countries needed them, these loans, it was because they needed third world countries to borrow from them. That's what happened. And now, of course, with the even though Powell has not increased interest rates to he has kept them to about 5%. Volcker at one point allowed them to go to 20%. That's another story altogether. But even this 5% is creating a debt crisis-like condition. So basically, what I want to say is that this experience, we must recall it to realize what a poisoned chalice private sector borrowing is for most third world countries. They should not be accepting it. And then finally, you are saying, about we'll go with whoever wants to industrialize. I mean, of course, in theory, I agree. Why should that not be the policy of any sovereign, economically autonomous country? It should be. But I think what people will find is that the United States is not willing to help industrialize. China is. And what's more, the United States is no longer at the cutting edge of technology. What does it have to offer third world countries compared to what China has to offer? So again, I think that the balance will go in favor of China, but just a small point about that point here. So there, I'm done now.
No, well, I was actually going to ask a follow-up question to that, because I know that you've written quite a bit about monopoly capitalism, particularly in the US. And I also think that in terms of industrial policy, this is where you see the differences, right? When you have in the US the context of monopolies dominating your industries, and you then introduce industrial policy in name, but it ends up actually not being as effective because the environment is not competitive, unlike China, where industrial policy seems to actually foster competitive. Because just looking at the EV industry, right? We have Tesla and maybe one other EV company in the US, and we have, what is it, 123 EV companies in China. I mean, and there I take your point very serious that if Sri Lanka wants to learn, it first of all, and I think many academics here should acknowledge the fact that now everywhere in the world there is acknowledgement that industrial policy is important. But then in terms of learning, your point of learning from China and perhaps now Vietnam as well seems to be on that same path. But it seems to be such a loaded term, as you were saying, Howard, in international circles. But in Sri Lanka, we know it's such a loaded term as well that still nobody wants to discuss it openly, and it's such a strange thing because the world is now clearly in that phase where, India as well, openly discussing industrial policy. Modi is suggesting quite frequently that this is the main part of his economic policy. But Radhika, I was wondering there how you see basically the implications for Sri Lanka from, let's say, these two countries applying industrial policy, US and China, and the do's and don'ts, as it were, for Sri Lanka if they want to learn from these two cases.
Sure. So first of all, let me just say that monopoly is, is the essence of neoliberalism. Now, this may seem like a very paradoxical statement, given that neoliberalism, the rhetoric of neoliberalism is always about competition and free markets. But I've argued for a long time that in reality, although neoliberalism spoke the language of free markets and competition, going back to its earliest beginnings, the neoclassical economics on which neoliberalism is based was born in the late 19th and early 20th century. That's when it got going. And that was the era of monopoly. So it is a foundational lie of neoliberalism is that there is still a competitive economy in most Western countries. There is not. There is capitalism had already entered the monopoly phase. And so neoliberalism is, to me, a gigantic intellectual fraud going back to its earliest days. And so when in the 1980s, people said we should free capital from the burdens of social regulation and Keynesian welfare state and so on. And once we free capital, everything will be fine, and capital will be reinvigorated and reacquire productive dynamism. None of these things happened for the simple reason that capitalism was no longer competitive in the Western world. And if you want to know more about this, I actually recently gave a lecture, which is on YouTube somewhere. It's called The Failure of Neoliberal Economics, in which I cover this much more comprehensively. But to come back to your question about monopoly, industrial policy, neoliberalism, etc., I would say that you see in those countries where capital controls the state, you will not have industrial policy. What will be called industrial policy will in fact be, as I say, simply a new channel through which subsidies can be given to big corporations. In China, however, what you are seeing is, China capital controls, the state controls capital, and that's why you're getting to see industrial success. And then you said about competition, China actually has a very interesting form of competition. It is a form of competition between, essentially in China, we think that the central government controls everything, but that's not the case. The Chinese economic strategy is highly decentralized, and the local governments have a lot of leeway, a lot of discretion. And it is the local governments that compete with one another to see who will industrialize better, etc. So if there are a lot of EV producers, it's because they are in different localities and backed by different local governments, all of whom are competing to see how much they can fulfill. So in a certain sense, how much they can produce and how successful they can be in this new technology and so on. So actually what you are looking at in China is a kind of competitive developmental states, in this case, locally developmental states. And that is a very fascinating element of the situation in China, which I'm sure other countries can learn from, but they have managed to do this. They have created, this is the form that competition takes in China as well. So, and one final point I will make is that, in principle, there is nothing wrong with monopoly. What's wrong in first world countries is that they remain privately owned. Because monopolies are in general a result of the fact that technology today creates conditions in which production on a large scale is really what is the most efficient. So there is nothing wrong in producing on a large scale. There's nothing wrong in having only one electricity company or only one railway company or what have you. In fact, railways are a natural monopoly, so why not just have one? The problem is that they are privately owned, and that they are essentially, when their monopolies are privately owned, they are sources of rentier incomes. Because if you can keep, you can, obviously within certain limits, but you can basically charge way above cost and get away with it for a very long time, right? So to me, the way, as I say, to come back to this, as far as industrial policy is concerned, what you simply need is you need states to control capital and require them to fulfill the national priorities as far as industrialization is concerned, and do not allow them the luxury of free capital flows. And I would say that would be a couple of the most important ingredients of industrial policy.
Well, that basically where the government should own companies and where not, in what sectors and what industries, has been a big part of the discussion here as well. And now the new president has said that, well, previously before he got into office, that he was planning to nationalize a lot and reverse some of the privatization plans that the previous government came up with. But Howard, I was wondering your experience here. Do you think any of the industries should be nationalized that were privatized in the past, and any thoughts on that going forward? Because I think he's going to have obvious difficulties there in the context of the IMF program, but then there seems to also be great resistance among the business community towards such a move.
The principle that I had goes back to what Radhika was talking about, is there are some industries, by their very nature, it's impossible to make them competitive and actually inadvisable. Things like energy and transport and so on, these are the ones we know are inadvisable. Great case in point is that the private sector is asking for transport, the rail system in the UK, to be renationalized because it's just not working. It's the idiocy of the highest order to think that something which is a natural monopoly can be made competitive. And I think the same is true of energy. And I believe this present government is going to try and look again at the energy bill. I mean, it doesn't mean to say that all aspects of energy production, distribution have to be in government hands. It's possible for some aspects of the retail section to be in private hands. It's possible. But the core, the production of energy, is something that requires scale. And whoever controls that has a monopoly control. I mean, everybody needs energy. I just wanted to say one thing anecdotally there is, if one looks at the standard neoclassical definition of competition, it's actually a definition of monopoly. Because everyone in the same industry produces identically the same product and uses identically the same techniques of production. In other words, there's only one company producing one product using one technology. In other words, it's a monopoly, you know, and that is the absurdity. Whereas Marx, when he described the process of competition, and he does it very well in volume 3, what he says is that the very nature of manufacturing production is constant diversification of the product in order to gain a surplus profit, and constant revolutionizing of the means of production. So actually each and every company has to have different products and different methods of production. And it's that drives technology. And that's why he actually, and you know, if you look at a lot of the Chinese writings, they actually laud competition for that purpose, you know, that it drives technology change and so on. And they even refer precisely to the passages in Marx, where Marx says that this is what real competition is about. Whereas what you were describing, Radhika, is what has happened is what Marx feared, is the tendency to monopoly, which is actually validated by neoclassical economics, because their competition actually describes a monopoly situation, which is bizarre, you know, but okay. It's something that I'm working on, as you can gather, in research which is coming out soon.
Right. I think we need to be wrapping up. I don't want to keep both of you for much longer, but I can see it's getting light where you are, Radhika, and it's getting dark here in Sri Lanka. Thank you both very much. I think we could go on for a very long time discussing these matters, and perhaps should. because there are such important implications for not just Sri Lanka, but all developing countries. Because what I gather from this discussion, attention needs to be paid to now really a shift in the global order. It is no longer the case that we have, let's say, not just the US, but the West as a collective dominating the global policy space. But this emergence of China and the other BRICS countries as powers seems to be creating a bit of space for developing countries in terms of alternatives. And the most important thing that both of you have highlighted there is the need for industrial policy, the need for developing countries to industrialize and to become economically independent, not rely on any nation, whether that is the West or China. Given that we know that the president watches our videos, that should be useful.
We hope.
We'll send it to him. We'll send it
I
his
think
way.
you should. Absolutely, you should.
We shall. Thank you both very much. And I hope to have both of you back on sometime in the near future. Thank you very much, Radhika.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Alan.
See you.
That's a wrap.
Bye.
See you.